In this video, we're going to be talking about some really cool tricks that you can do with dates. And this is a part of our advanced SQL sessions. Now, the one caveat is these functions that I'm about to show you are very new to SQL Server. In fact, you'd have to have version 2022 in order to have this. Now, you might be thinking, well, I'm on Azure SQL and these functions will work there. But it's likely that your version of Azure SQL, while it's the latest version because it's evergreen, there's two components to a SQL Server version. There's the actual version of the software installed on the server, which is evergreen with Azure SQL, but there's also a database compatibility level. And that's a separate versioning for each database. And Microsoft is very careful about how they update the software, and they don't always they want to ensure that they don't break anything in your database. So it could be that your database compatibility level is not the latest. And it's really easy to change that. You can just do an alter database. Where it says rock here, you'd change it to your database name, and you can set the compatibility level to 160. Generally speaking, this is a very safe practice. I've done it numerous times and have never had a problem, but and you can always set it back. So it's not like a one-way change. You can always set it back. Okay, having said that, let's jump in and talk about some of these new functions. The first function is called date bucket. So let's look at the syntax for the date bucket function. Basically, you just say date bucket, and then you give it a date part. And we're going to go over this in an example, so this might seem a little hard to understand at first, but you give it a date part, so that'd be kind of like day, week, month. Then you give it a number of how big you want your bucket to be, and then you give it the actual date. The origin, we'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but that's a really advanced feature you pretty much don't need, and it's optional. But the first three parameters are required: the date part, the number, and a date. So let's look at an example. In this example, we're looking at financial transactions, and basically what we're trying to do is create a date bucket with the transaction date time. So we're trying to get the week that this date, this transaction happened. Like what is the week that it is? So think of these buckets as just exactly what it says. It's like a bucket. So I want to create buckets for weeks. And so let's take a look at the output here. So we can see the actual transaction date time, and then we can see our new bucketed date time that we call week date. And so if we put a calendar up against this, we can kind of see that on our first line, 8/01 is on a Saturday. So the week that date belongs to is actually the previous week. So that'd be the 27th. But then when we go to the next row, which is August 4th, that's a Tuesday, but its actual bucketed week is going to be on the 3rd. So you can kind of see that the weeks start on a Monday and they end on a Sunday. And so it's if we go down another row, we'll see that, the next transaction was on the 6th, but it also shares the 3rd because it's in the same week. So again, just like the name says, we're creating buckets. And in this case, we said we want weekly buckets. Now, in this use case, it's very similar to what we do with our analytics source date table. So that table, if you join to it, allows you to do this same kind of thing. But as you'll see here soon, that this date bucket has a lot of other options that table doesn't have. Before we go into those, let's look at the different date parts that we can use. So we can create buckets that are days. Now you might be thinking, well, that doesn't really make sense. But think about that in terms of if we use day buckets, we're basically just stripping off the time component of a date time, which actually is kind of nice. A lot of times we have to write SQL taking into consideration things like, a date's time and midnight. If you're trying to do greater than or less than, sometimes that date time gets in the way. And a date bucket would actually fix that. We saw the example I just did was on weeks, but we could do months, quarters, years, hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds. The hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds are actually kind of cool if you're doing things like looking at attendance data. You can start making buckets in those units also. I told you we'd come back to that unit of the number. So in this case, we're going to create date buckets, and they're going to be in terms of weeks, but it's going to be in terms of 2 weeks. So sometimes you might want to do groupings that are multiple units. So like every 2 weeks, how many people checked in? And so this is a really great way of doing that very easily. I said I'd come back to the origin. This is really advanced. Most of the time, you're never going to have to touch this, but this actually allows you to change that concept of when does the week start. Monday. If you give the origin as in terms of a date, you can actually change it to Tuesday or Sunday or Saturday. So that origin allows you to kind of change the default start and end time for things like weeks. Okay, so let's move on to our next function. The next function is called generate series. And so let's look at a quick, easy example of how generate series works. So here is a select statement. And basically, we're selecting actually from the function. Now, a lot of people didn't realize that you can actually use certain types of functions in a from clause. So we're not actually touching a database table here. We're just getting the data from the function. So we're saying select value from generate series, starting with 1, going through 5. And so what would that look like? Kind of like that. So it just is like a counter. It gives us intervals, and it can make sure that every number between those two numbers is represented. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, how would I use this? Here's a starting example. So basically what we want to do here is we want to calculate and get every hour between 2 date times. So if you look at our start date time and our end date time, it's the same date, but it's 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And so what this is going to allow us to do using the date bucket and the generate series is that it's going to allow us to count the hours between the start time and this end time. So at the top, we're just, starting to say, hey, we want to create buckets by hour, and then we're going to use the generate series, and we're going to, start at 0, and we're going to go for every hour between those two date times. And so that would look something like this. So again, we have the same date, but we're counting every hour between those times. Okay, so let's look at another example, then we'll kind of make this more practical. This is doing the same thing, but this time we're going to be doing it for days. So our start and end date time are multiple days between them, and using pretty much the same logic, we're going to generate every day between those dates. Now, again, like why would we do this? Well, sometimes when we're working with our data, we want to see counts by day, but it's possible that our data actually doesn't have every day inside of it. So, maybe if you want to look at giving by that metric, if you have a church of any size, you probably have a gift coming in on every day, but maybe not. And this will guarantee you that you don't have any gaps in your data, right? So this generate series is a way of ensuring that you don't have gaps. Here's a real use case. This query is actually kind of nice. If you wanted to go and look at your service job history table, and you wanted to see how many jobs were launched on every hour, this would actually be able to calculate it for you. Now, again, it's likely that you have a job kicking off in at least once in every hour, but maybe not. Or maybe you want to change your bucket size to minutes. Maybe you're trying to determine what minutes, maybe you have a lot of stuff going on. It's perhaps likely that you don't have a job kicking off in a minute. We do have a couple of jobs that kick off very often, so that could hamper that, but not always. But again, this is a way of just making sure that every single, in this case, hour can be counted. So kind of an interesting function. It has some good use cases in making sure that you don't have gaps in your data. This is the actual syntax, so you just give it the start, stop, and you can give it an optional step. So if you want to go every 2 hours, you could also do that. Okay, next function, date trunk. So what this allows you to do is it basically allows you to do calculations with dates without having to worry about time. So here is kind of an all items in the day problem. So if I want to get all the items for October 1st, 2015, there's a lot of different ways to solve that. Sometimes we would do this, so we'd have to go up a day. So we go, because we have to worry about the time component of this. And so if I just left it at, where it's 8/1/2015, I'd have to go in there and put like 11:59:59, and even that is not super precise. You could be off by a split second. So some people do this. They just go up a day and say, well, it has to be less than that date. You could now use this date trunc. And so what date trunc does is it just truncates it to the interval that you give it. In this case, we're giving it the interval of day. And so it just strips off the time. And so we can say where it's equal to 8/1/2015. So again, it just trunks the data for you. Now you want to be a little bit careful when you use functions like this inside the where clause. Doing this sometimes can mean that indexes aren't able to be used. So it kind of depends on your query plan and how you're doing your filtering. So you got to be a little bit careful, not just with date trunc, but with a lot of different filters. This, again, has the same interval date parts that you would expect from the other one. So you can date trunc to a day, to a week, to a month. So this is kind of nice too. With date trunc, what you can do is say, well, give it a date and it's going to trunc it to the month. So it's going to bring things to the first of the month. So another cool little trick if you want to do grouping by month. Okay, so those are the new filters that we wanted to show you, and hopefully you'll be able to see how you can use this inside of your SQL to your benefit. Hope it's been helpful.